Hello, Varlets. It's been a while since my last video, but today I wanted to talk about this patch notes, the latest one that Fatshark just released. And I know I'm a couple days late. This was released on July 6th. It's now July 8th. I had some thoughts that I wanted to kind of let simmer for a bit before I made this video. So this patch notes contains basically one main fix, and that is the fix to the auto aim for ACD, Advanced Combat Doctrines, that would miss if you were shooting at targets while they are moving sideways. So I'm very glad that Fatshark decided to fix this issue before they went on their holidays, and that's because I had a couple of builds that I wanted to put together that involved using ACD, but it felt really bad to use because of this issue. And now that I've played a little bit with the change, I can get on to kind of putting those videos together. But the meat of this video is going to be with this dev note here, specifically this part here. We are currently looking at their Blitz abilities, the Skitarii, addressing their issues regarding balance, usability, and how they fit into the kit of the Skitarii class. So at this point, the class has been out for about 2 weeks now. It released on the 23rd of June. It's now the 8th. And we probably have a very good idea on where the class sits in terms of balance. Overall, and this is just my surface thoughts, I think the Skitarii class is quite balanced. There are some deficiencies of the things of its kit that could be addressed, but overall, I don't think it's overpowered by any means. Now, specifically with the Blitz abilities, I think we all know what this is going to be talking about. Because as far as build crafting goes, there's pretty much only one Blitz worth using, and that is the Servo Skull. And this isn't to say that the other blitzers are weak, but it's more to do with the opportunity cost of picking up the other blitzers compared to the Servo Skull. So what I'm going to talk about in this video is addressing how Fatshark might want to approach the balance for the other two blitzers compared to the Servo Skull. But to do that, first I want to establish a baseline about where the Servo Skull sits, what it can do, and how the other two blitzers can be kind of tweaked, I guess, so that it's competitive with them. The ideal situation is that each of them look so good on paper and in practice that making a build makes solving problems with that particular blitz feel much more consistent and much more impactful. Because right now, it doesn't feel that way, and only the Servo Skull dominates. So let's start with that first. The default blitz you start off with the Skitarii is the Servo Skull. On its own, it's a little bit of DPS. It doesn't shoot very fast. It deals very mediocre damage, but what it mostly does is serves as a utility tool for you to solve those hacking puzzles without having to commit yourself to them. So it does take a little bit longer, but that means you don't have to be defended or have to defend someone doing it. When you pick up the Blitz itself, the Artificer Servo Skull upgrade, that increases its damage substantially because it reduces the fire rate. It also applies a burn damage tick up to 8 stacks. And most importantly, it applies a debuff on an enemy that's hit, causing them to take 15% damage from all sources. That is incredibly powerful value on its own because there are only 3 ways to increase damage in the game. That is through damage buffs, strength buffs, as well as applying debuffs on enemies. And debuffs are one of the hardest ones to come by. So having a Servo Skull that is up the entire game that costs you nothing other than allocating the point into it to apply this debuff to any monster you hit or any target you can hit is incredibly good. This is before you consider applying points into Noospheric Command, which massively increases the DPS output of the Servo Skull, allowing it to solo elites and even kill specials on its own. That is really, really powerful. Then you bring in the Medicae Servo Skull, which allows you to clutch a game like no other because you can rescue teammates from afar. And if you can rescue one teammate, that teammate can then get up and then rescue other teammates around themselves. So even just having a single charge of the Medicae Servo Skull is very good value. And lastly, we have the Flamethrower Servo Skull, which is okay. I don't think it's bad. It's just not as impactful as the other two in terms of value you can get. It's really good value for dealing with mixed hordes, especially when you have to focus down a monster or a boss in the middle of the horde, and so the Flamethrower Skull can help deal with part of the problems. But overall, the other two nodes offer the most value. So, with how much the Servo Skull can give you into your build and support your team, the other two options need to hold up in order to be viable. So the main one that has a problem right now is the integrated refraction emitter, or the shield, the refraction shield. So what I'm going to do is read to you what it does first, and then we can kind of balance it out from there. At base, the integrated refraction emitter surrounds yourself in a shield that absorbs all incoming range damage. It lasts for 8 seconds, and upon activation and when it ends, it emits an electrical pulse that electrocutes all nearby enemies within a 5-meter radius of you. The description on its own is already a little bit problematic because it's not exactly doing how it sounds like. It reads as surround yourself in a shield that absorbs all incoming range damage. And the first thought when you read that is that you might think this is a cycle bubble, because that's what the cycle bubble does. It provides you a 360 shield, it absorbs incoming range fire, and then it dissipates when it runs out of health. The Skitarii shield does not do that. What it does is it sets your Skitarii into the is dodging state against range damage for the duration of the blitz. So, in other words, this is basically Desperado, but without the buffs. And so for the next 8 to 12 seconds, you can just completely ignore all range damage. It is not a physical shield like the Cycle Bubble, which means it cannot block Beast of Nurgle Vomit. And that means you can't just stand in front of it and tank it like you normally would expect to with a Psycho Shield. So it works differently in that sense. On its own, it's very good utility because it means you can rush into range enemies, you can avoid being shredded by them, especially in Havocs, and you can clutch a rescue as well. So if a fallen ally is getting shot by 12 Reapers, you can just activate this and just pick them up, no problem. So there's utility to how this Blitz can work. The problem is its cost. Unlike the Servo Skull at base, which doesn't require any grenades, for some reason, the integrated refraction emitter, which supposedly sounds like it's part of the Skitarii's kit, requires grenade charges. And I think that's one of the main reasons why no one wants to run it. Forget the additional value that it might add. Naturally, the direction of the conversation about how to balance this ability was steered into the fact that it should be using capacitance, which I agree with. In fact, I think one of the early discussions or one of the points that I read was that it should use charges, compatibility charges, like how the rest of our compatibilities do. But I think that there are some balancing considerations that need to be thought about if we go down that route. Specifically, if it's just consuming a charge and then the ability goes up and then you can rebuild charges while it's up, there is a potential balancing problem where you could just keep farming back the charges again and again and then keep the blitz up over and over. This essentially allows you to make yourself completely immune to range enemies for the entire game, which I don't think is exactly the most healthiest thing. So I think that while it should be using charges, there should be another layer of balancing on it so that we avoid this issue of infinite range immunity. And that is to take a page from ACD. When you activate ACD, you first consume 25% capacitance. And then after that, every second that you are in ACD, it drains 10%. I think something similar should be implemented into the Refraction Shield Blitz on top of requiring a charge requirement. So what this means is that to activate the Blitz, you first need at least one charge, but when you activate it, it consumes, say, 50% capacitance to give you 3 or 4 seconds of range immunity, after which it will start draining 10% capacitance for every second you have it up, and you'll keep draining until you run out of ability charge. In practice, I think this approach is going to be much more sustainable and balanced for the ability, because what this means is that if you just need to activate the ability to pick someone up, you only spend 50% of your capacitance just for that 4 seconds of range immunity. That's more than enough to get an ally up and then start running away from fire. On the other hand, if you want to use the Blitz to sustain your combat, then you can keep it on and it drains 10% per second, and you can keep it on for as long as, I think the math was 28 seconds if you had 3 charges. 28 seconds of complete range immunity is also really, really strong. And if that does sound too strong, then the balancing levers that you have is to mess with the initial capacitance cost, so that's the activation cost of 50%, or you can tweak the drain rate. So for example, if you keep the 50% capacitance cost and increase the drain rate to 15% instead of 10, then the total duration would drop from 28 seconds to around 20 seconds, which I think is also okay. 20 seconds is about the normal time you expect to stay in Desperado as well. So that's one way I think that you could balance the refraction shield's cost to at least make it attractive to use instead of the Servo Skull. This is really good for frontlining builds, especially where you might not necessarily want to have a Servo Skull and instead you want to double down your ability to close the gap and disrupt the enemies. I think then that this change would make those kind of builds much more viable and more fun as well. For the Arc Grenade, I think it has also some issues that needs to be addressed. The main problem with it right now is consistency. Now, I've released a full Arc Lightning kind of guide or breakdown on how the grenade works. And in practice and in paper, it's actually very strong. It can one-shot a whole bunch of crushers if the conditions are right. The problem is getting those right conditions. It's kind of a Goldilocks grenade where you can't have too little enemies because then you don't create enough Arc Lightning. And you can't have too many enemies because then you spread out the damage too thin. You need to have just the right amount of enemies so that enough enemies can get hit by multiple arcs of lightning at once. So for this grenade, its issues is consistency as well as availability. Because it only has 3 grenades, and if you're playing in the higher Havocs, for example, you might not actually get any grenades at all. This also further incentivizes you to use the Servo Skull because you're not depending on grenades, and the only time you might need it is when you need to revive someone, which is obviously going to be worth a grenade charge. But for the arc grenade, it's very situational in when you can use it, and when you can use it is also very limited because you only have 3 grenades. So my proposal to help improve its consistency is to first increase its arc lightning damage. Right now, it does about 1000 damage per arc, and this is enough to wipe out crushers on Auric. But when you get up into the higher difficulties, enemy health is increased by as much as 50%. So the damage you were initially doing down on Auric might not be enough to actually wipe out enemies in the higher difficulties. Therefore, that makes this grenade a lot less viable the more higher up you go. So my proposal is to increase the damage from 1000 to 1500, maybe even 2000, which might sound a bit excessive here. The reason for this is that at 1005, I think, with some minor buffs built into the Skitarii's kit, you can reliably at least kill shotgunners and gunners. So those enemies, if they get hit by a single arc, will die instantly, which I think is fair, you know. When it comes to the tanky enemies, because Crushers on Havoc 40 have 9750 health, the base 1000 might not be enough because that means the Crusher has to be hit by 9 different lightning arcs, which I don't think is enough at all, and it cannot hit. But with 1500 damage, if you get hit by 6 different arcs, it's about close to that. It's 9000 base. But again, because you have other buffs that can influence the grenade damage, you might be able to one-shot a Havoc 40 Crusher, which I think is fair given how situational these grenades are. The other thing I would do as well is to increase the grenade charges from 3 to maybe 4 or even 5. I think at 5 grenades, it's in a very comfortable spot for you to throw it out when the situation demands it. So in some games, you might just start the game with having to deal with a Bulwark pack, a Crusher pack, Reapers and Gunners at the backline, fighting a Chaos Spawn as well as the Twins. These are the moments where this arc grenade might prove to have the most value because you can just chuck 2 of them out, wipe out the backline, wipe out the front line, and now your focus can be on the Chaos Spawn and the bosses. You don't have to worry too much about the Crushers because your arc grenade has done its job. And I think that's kind of fair. In the lower difficulties, in Auric for example, this is going to be a very either preemptive grenade. You see a whole bunch of ambient elites standing around doing nothing. You can throw one grenade, wipe that out, and move on your merry way. Or you can use it as a clutch tool. So when you encounter difficulty spikes like weakened monsters spawn at the same time as a Crusher Wave, then these grenades will do their job very well. So yeah, these are my initial thoughts about what I think Fatshark could consider when it comes to balancing the blitzes around the Skitarii's kit overall, but also taking into account the different difficulties that these blitzes will be operating at. I know that balancing in Havoc 40 is definitely not the way to do because that is like the most insane level of difficulty that is unfair that you shouldn't be balancing against unfair. But even on Auric and Auric Maelstrom, which I think is where balancing should be looked at, these blitzers currently don't perform as well as they ought to be doing because of consistency and because of availability. And so I think the proposals I've made here are fair enough to at least be a starting point for discussion. So let me know what you think about these changes, how you feel about the grenades, and what Fatshark might be thinking about when it comes to balancing them. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Varlets.